cold-blooded bikers threaten a truck driver. His unexpected move stuns them. The sound of roaring engines echoed across the desolate highway, cutting through the early morning fog like a jagged blade. The sun, still hidden behind the mountains, cast long, twisted shadows along the asphalt. A single truck, weathered by years of hard work, rumbled down the road, its engine coughing and sputtering as it fought to maintain speed. Inside, the truck driver, Jim, gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles pale under the pressure. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold morning air, and his eyes flicked nervously to the rearview mirror. Behind him, the growl of motorcycles grew louder with each passing second. A gang of bikers, clad in black leather jackets, their faces obscured by dark helmets, appeared like phantoms in the mist. They had been tailing him for miles, their aggressive presence unmistakable. Jim had heard the rumors, stories of bikers who preyed on truck drivers, robbing them, intimidating them, or worse. His heart pounded in his chest as the group of bikers moved in closer. The leader, a towering man with a scar running down his left cheek, revved his engine, signaling for his gang to close the gap. Jim's fingers tightened around the gear shift, the metal of the truck groaning in response. Just a little further, Jim muttered to himself, his voice low and strained. The checkpoint's not far. I just need to make it there. But the bikers were relentless, closing in with an almost predatory sense of purpose. As they pulled up alongside the truck, the leader signaled for the others to move into position. Jim's eyes darted to the side, catching sight of the menacing group. They had him surrounded now, 3 motorcycles on either side, one in front, and the leader taking the rear. Their engines roared louder than ever, a warning that Jim couldn't ignore. A cold sweat broke out on Jim's brow as the leader of the pack reached for his helmet, pulling it off and revealing a face as hard as stone. His eyes gleamed with a dangerous glint, and a cruel smile stretched across his face. Not going anywhere, pal, the leader growled, his voice grating like sandpaper. He nodded toward the road ahead. You've got a little problem. Jim swallowed hard, his mind racing. This wasn't just a random encounter, it was a setup. They wanted something from him, and from the look in their eyes, they wouldn't hesitate to take it by force. I'm not interested in any trouble, Jim replied, his voice steady but filled with tension. He shifted nervously in his seat, trying to gauge the situation. Just let me go. I'll keep driving. The leader's grin widened, and his gang closed in even tighter, their bikes growling like beasts in the shadows. The leader's eyes locked onto Jim's, and the truck driver could feel a shiver crawl up his spine. He was outnumbered, outmatched, and trapped. But he wasn't ready to give up just yet. Listen here, trucker, the leader continued, his voice dripping with menace. We've got a score to settle with you. You stop that rig, step out, and hand over your cash. No one gets hurt. Jim's pulse quickened. He wasn't carrying any cash, but he knew that didn't matter. These men weren't the type to let little things like that get in the way. They were looking for an excuse, a reason to make him suffer. Listen, Jim said again, his voice barely a whisper now, though his words carried the weight of desperation. I don't want any trouble. Just let me pass through. You can take whatever you want, just... But the leader cut him off with a sharp, mocking laugh. You think we'll just let you go? You've crossed us. There's no way out now. The bikers surrounding him nodded, some of them revving their engines aggressively, others sneering, anticipating the violence that was about to unfold. For a moment, everything went still. The wind picked up, ruffling the leaves along the roadside, but the sound of the engines was all-consuming. Jim could hear the blood pounding in his ears, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. He had to think fast, his life was on the line. And then, something unexpected happened. With a sudden motion, Jim slammed the truck's horn, the deafening blast shattering the tense silence. The bikers flinched, taken aback by the sound, but Jim didn't stop there. Without warning, he slammed the truck into overdrive and sped forward, the tires screeching as they fought to gain traction. For a split second, the bikers were caught off guard, their motorcycles losing ground. The leader's eyes widened in shock, and he barked an order to his gang. but Jim was already several meters ahead. "Get him," the leader shouted, but Jim had already made his move, and now there was no turning back. The truck roared down the road at an alarming speed, weaving between the motorcycles as they scrambled to catch up. Jim's heart raced as he steered the massive truck with precision, the pressure of the moment forcing him to push every ounce of his driving skills to the limit. The bikers were fast, but they weren't fast enough. Jim could see the leader's furious expression in his side mirror as he fumbled for his radio to call for reinforcements. Jim's hands shook, but his resolve hardened. He wasn't just fighting for his life, he was fighting for his dignity, for his future. He wasn't going to let these cold-blooded bikers dictate his fate. As the truck thundered forward, Jim's mind raced. He knew the road ahead would be even more treacherous, but for now, he had bought himself some time. But the bikers weren't giving up. They were closing in again, and the real danger was only beginning. The road stretched out before Jim like a dark, endless tunnel. His breath was ragged as he gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles pale from the force. The truck's engine roared like a beast, its power growing with every gear shift. But the bikers weren't far behind. Jim could hear the unmistakable sound of their engines growling, gaining on him with each passing second. The tension in the air was suffocating. The road ahead was winding, narrow, and treacherous. Jim knew this stretch of highway well. He had driven it countless times, but this time it felt different. Every turn seemed sharper, every bump in the road more dangerous. His eyes flicked nervously to the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of the leader's bike, cutting through the fog like a predator hunting its prey. He could see the hatred in the man's eyes, burning through the distance between them. The gang was relentless, and Jim knew they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted, or until they had nothing left to lose. The leader was fast, and his gang was just as determined. They weaved through the traffic like it was nothing, closing the distance with alarming speed. Jim could feel the weight of their presence on his shoulders. He couldn't outrun them forever. His truck was heavy, sluggish at times, but it had the power to push through when needed. The bikers, on the other hand, were nimble, quick, and dangerous. Jim's mind raced, his thoughts swirling in a chaotic frenzy. He needed a plan, fast. His eyes darted to the side of the road, where a series of sharp turns and steep hills awaited. The type of terrain that would throw even the most skilled driver off course. If he could just make it there, if he could just navigate those bends, it might buy him enough time to lose them. It was his only chance. With a sharp intake of breath, Jim slammed the gas pedal to the floor, pushing the truck to its limits. The engine screamed in protest as the speedometer climbed, but Jim didn't care. He had no choice. His hands tightened, sweat dripping down his face as the wind whipped against the window. The fog had started to clear, but the danger was still very real. Behind him, the gang was closing in, their engines roaring like thunder. The leader's bike cut through the mist, determined and unyielding. Jim could see him reaching for something he knew wasn't going to be good. But Jim wasn't just going to sit back and let them catch him. He had no intention of being an easy target. As the gang approached, Jim's eyes flicked to the sharp curve in the road ahead. It was a gamble. If he could make the turn at the right speed, he might be able to lose them. If he didn't, the consequences would be catastrophic. "Hold on," Jim muttered under his breath as he veered toward the curve, his truck tilting dangerously. The wheels screeched as the truck leaned into the bend, its massive body almost tipping over. The first biker made it through the curve easily, but the second one was too fast, too reckless. As he tried to follow Jim's path, his front wheel slid, sending him crashing into the guardrail with a deafening crash. The rider was thrown from his bike, his body rolling to the side as the motorcycle flipped over and exploded in a burst of flame. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the sound of the other bikers swerving, narrowly avoiding the wreckage. But Jim didn't slow down. He couldn't afford to. The leader was still on his tail, rage evident in his every movement. He had lost one of his men, but the chase wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Jim's heart pounded in his chest, but he pushed forward, focusing on the road ahead. The truck rumbled beneath him, its heavy body swaying with each violent turn. Sweat dripped from his brow, stinging his eyes, but he didn't blink. Every second counted. The leader's bike was now right next to the truck. His furious eyes locked onto Jim. Jim could feel the heat of the biker's anger, could almost taste it in the air. The leader shouted something. Jim didn't catch the words, but the fury in his voice was unmistakable. Jim's grip on the steering wheel tightened, his fingers trembling with adrenaline. He had to do something, anything, to get away. And then, in an instant, it came to him. A sharp turn to the left led into a small, forgotten side road. It was a risky move, but if he could make it through, he might have a chance to lose them in the maze of old backroads. Without hesitation, Jim jerked the wheel to the left, slamming the truck into a sharp, tight turn. The tires squealed as the truck lurched forward, its weight shifting dangerously. The truck's suspension groaned under the pressure, but Jim didn't care. He had made his choice. Behind him, the leader roared in fury as his bike swerved to follow, but the narrow road was unforgiving. The leader was skilled, but not skilled enough to make the turn without losing control. His bike skidded, the rear tire catching gravel and sending him careening into a ditch. Jim's breath caught in his throat as he pushed the truck forward. The road was rough, bumpy, and unpredictable, but it was his only chance. His eyes never left the road ahead. His mind focused on one thing: survival. The gang was scattered, and the leader was out of the picture for now. But Jim knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He had made his escape, but the danger wasn't gone. He had bought himself some time, but the bikers weren't going to give up that easily. Jim's heart was racing, the pounding of his pulse ringing in his ears. His hands, slick with sweat, gripped the steering wheel with an iron resolve. The road ahead was no longer just a path to safety. It had become a battleground. The bikes were still out there, somewhere, lurking in the distance, waiting for the right moment to strike. The narrow backroads twisted and turned in every direction, their rugged terrain offering little comfort. The truck bounced violently over bumps and potholes, the sound of metal scraping against gravel ringing in the cabin like a death knell. Jim's mind was clouded with one thought: how long can I keep this up? He had made the right choice, taking the side road. The bikers had been left behind, scattered, some still recovering from the collision at the sharp bend. But Jim knew he couldn't afford to slow down. He couldn't afford to rest, even for a moment. The leader was still out there, somewhere, and Jim had no doubt that he would come for him. Behind him, the sounds of engines were growing faint. But Jim couldn't allow himself to be fooled. The bikers were relentless. They wouldn't stop until they had him. His truck crested a small hill, and Jim saw a sign in the distance. It read, "Dead End." His stomach dropped. The road was ending, and fast. He slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching in protest as the truck skidded to a halt. The truck's engine groaned as it came to a stop, but Jim didn't have time to savor the moment of fleeting safety. He quickly assessed his surroundings. The road behind him had begun to narrow, and there was nowhere to go but forward. The woods loomed on either side, dark and silent, hiding whatever secrets lay within. He could hear them now, the distant roar of motorcycles growing closer. The leader wasn't far behind, and his rage was palpable. Jim's eyes flicked to the side, and he spotted a small dirt path leading into the trees. It was a risk, but it was his only chance. He threw the truck into gear and gunned the engine, pushing it forward into the unknown. The path was rough, barely wide enough for the truck. Branches scraped against the sides, threatening to tear off pieces of the truck's exterior. Jim's knuckles were white from gripping the wheel, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he tried to keep the truck steady. The wheels slipped on the loose dirt, and for a moment he thought they might get stuck. But then, the truck surged forward, the tires finding purchase on the uneven ground. Jim pushed on, his eyes focused ahead. The sound of the bikers grew louder again, and the leader's bike screeched as it tore through the woods behind him. The road was narrow, and Jim knew that if he lost control, there would be no way to recover. The trees were dense, their thick trunks threatening to block any escape. The truck jolted again, and this time, it wasn't the dirt or rocks that caused the bump. It was a large root that had snaked across the path, throwing the vehicle off balance. Jim cursed under his breath, slamming his foot on the brake. The truck skidded to a halt just inches from a tree. "Come on," Jim muttered to himself. "Don't fail me now." His heart was in his throat as he checked the rearview mirror. The leader's bike was still behind him, but the rest of the gang had fallen behind. Jim's mind was racing, calculating his next move. The path was too narrow to outrun them through the woods, and the biker's agility was their greatest advantage. If they cornered him, there would be no escape. Jim's eyes landed on something in the distance. Clearing. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give him a glimmer of hope. He could make a break for it, but the bikers were too close, too fast. He could hear the engine of the leader's bike revving up, preparing to close the distance. With a deep breath, Jim steered the truck toward the clearing. The tires screeched again as he floored the gas pedal, the truck lurching forward as it plunged into the open space. It was a gamble, a final attempt to escape. But just as Jim was about to pull into the clearing, the leader's bike roared past him, blocking his path. The truck slammed to a halt, inches away from the biker, the brakes screeching as the truck came to a stop. Jim's heart slammed against his chest as he saw the leader's face, twisted with fury, just inches from his own. The leader stopped, turning to face him with a mocking smile. "You thought you could outrun me, huh?" he sneered, revving the engine of his bike once again. "You're not going anywhere, trucker." Jim's mind was racing. The bikers were closing in fast, their motorcycles circling him like vultures. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. This was it, the moment he'd feared. But then a thought struck him. His hands moved quickly, and he slammed the truck into reverse, spinning the wheel with all his strength. The truck lurched backward, throwing gravel and dirt into the air as the tires screamed in protest. Jim's eyes locked onto the leader, whose bike was now turning around, preparing to charge. Jim wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. With a final, desperate push, Jim slammed the truck into drive, hurtling forward in a blind panic. And then something unexpected happened. Jim's heart pounded as he slammed his foot on the gas pedal, the truck screeching forward into the clearing. The engine growled, its sound deafening in the tense silence of the woods. But the leader was quicker, his bike roaring as it swerved and cut across the path, blocking Jim's way once more. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow down. Jim's hands shook as they gripped the wheel, his pulse racing. The truck was moving too fast, and the narrow space between him and the leader's bike was closing fast. Jim's eyes darted to the side, his brain scrambling for a solution, for any way to get out of this. But the leader was relentless. The man's cruel smile grew wider, and Jim could see the gleam of a knife in his hand, the blade reflecting the faint light that filtered through the trees. "You're trapped now," the leader snarled, his voice full of contempt. "There's nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. You're finished." Jim's stomach churned with fear, but something deep inside him ignited. He couldn't go down without a fight. He couldn't let these cold-blooded bikers have the satisfaction of defeating him. His mind raced, and in that split second, an idea formed. The truck wasn't just a means of escape, it was a weapon, and Jim was going to use it. Without warning, Jim swerved the wheel, sending the truck skidding sideways, tires screeching in protest. The movement caught the leader off guard, his bike swerving to avoid the truck's heavy frame. The leader's eyes widened in shock as he tried to regain control of his bike, but it was too late. Jim seized the opportunity. With a sudden burst of speed, he threw the truck into reverse, accelerating with reckless abandon. The truck's massive body crushed through the brush and the trees, its metal frame scraping against the ground as it powered backward. The leader's bike, caught off guard, tried to break away, but Jim's truck was on a collision course. There was a sickening crunch as the truck rammed into the side of the bike, sending it tumbling into the dirt. The leader was thrown from his bike, his body slamming hard against the ground as his motorcycle skidded to a stop. For a brief moment, everything was still. Jim's breath came in short, shallow gasps as he watched the leader struggle to get up, his face twisted in pain and fury. Jim wasn't about to give him a chance to recover. With a swift motion, he slammed the truck into drive and sped forward once more, heading directly toward the leader. But before Jim could reach him, the rest of the gang arrived, roaring through the trees. Their bikes appeared from the shadows like specters, each rider determined to finish what the leader had started. Jim's eyes flicked to the side, and he saw the path ahead. A steep hill that led down into a valley. He could take the hill, try to lose them in the rough terrain. It was risky, but it was his only option. Jim's mind snapped into focus. He had no time to waste. He slammed the gas pedal to the floor, the truck lurching forward with an earth-shattering roar. The bikers followed in hot pursuit, their engines vibrating the air around them. The truck bounced over the uneven ground as it hurtled toward the hill. Jim's hands were steady now, his body tense with adrenaline. The sound of the bikers behind him grew louder, but Jim kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The hill was steep, its incline challenging, but it was the only way out. The truck surged upward, its engine straining with the effort. Jim could feel the weight of the vehicle as it struggled to climb, the wheels slipping on the loose gravel. His heart raced as the truck lurched and jolted, its tires screeching for traction. He could see the bikers closing in, their headlights like burning eyes, but he couldn't slow down. The hill steepened, and Jim could feel the truck's momentum faltering. He gritted his teeth, forcing the truck to push harder. The wheels spun furiously, throwing up dirt and rocks as the engine screamed in protest. The bikers were gaining, their bikes roaring just behind him. "Come on," Jim muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "You can do this." With one final push, the truck reached the top of the hill, its front end rising into the air as it crested the ridge. Jim held his breath, praying the truck wouldn't tip over. The weight shifted, and for a moment, it felt as though the truck was about to tumble backward. But then, the wheels found solid ground, and the truck shot forward, gaining speed as it hurtled down the other side of the hill. The bikers, unable to match the truck's momentum, were left behind, their engines screaming in frustration. Jim's heart was in his throat as the truck sped downhill. The ground was uneven, and the truck bounced wildly, its tires barely holding on. Jim's grip on the wheel tightened as he maneuvered the truck, guiding it down the treacherous slope. The bikers were still behind, but they couldn't catch up. Not with the truck's momentum. The ground leveled out, and Jim's heart surged with a new hope. He wasn't out of danger yet, but for the first time in what felt like hours, he could breathe. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Jim had bought himself some time. He pushed the truck faster, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the bikers. The sound of their engines was growing distant, but Jim wasn't ready to relax. He couldn't let his guard down now. The leader was down, and several of the bikers had been shaken off, but Jim knew better than to think the chase was over. The bikers were persistent, and they would be back. But Jim had made a decision. He wasn't going down without a fight, and this time he would be ready. The truck sped through the valley, its engine roaring in defiance of the chaos behind it. Jim's hands were still tight on the wheel, sweat dripping from his forehead, but he couldn't afford to ease up. The bikers were relentless. He could hear their engines growling in the distance, getting closer. But for now, Jim had gained precious ground. The truck's tires kicked up dirt and debris as it tore across the rough terrain, its headlights slicing through the twilight. The road ahead was open, but Jim knew he wasn't safe yet. The bikers weren't going to give up. He could already hear their engines closing in, their guttural growls cutting through the stillness of the valley. The leader, Jim hadn't seen him in a while, but he knew he was out there, lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. Jim's heart was pounding, but his mind was clear. Every muscle in his body was focused on one thing: survival. He had outsmarted the gang so far, but he couldn't keep this up forever. The truck wasn't built for speed, and the bikers had the advantage of agility. Jim knew that if they caught him on the open road, it would be over. But something inside him refused to give up. He wasn't going to let them win. Not today. The valley stretched out before him, a narrow path between two jagged cliffs. It was the kind of place where anyone could get trapped, where there was no escape if you weren't careful. Jim knew this road well. He had driven it before many times. It was a shortcut, but it was also dangerous. Perfect spot for an ambush. And that's exactly what Jim was planning. He hit the brakes hard, the truck sliding to a halt just as the valley narrowed even further. The tires screeched as the truck shuddered under the sudden deceleration. Jim threw the gearshift into reverse, the truck's engine roaring in protest as he maneuvered it back into position. He needed a plan, something to get the bikers off his tail for good. And then it hit him. With a deep breath, Jim threw the truck into drive once again. But this time, he didn't just speed ahead. He steered it toward a large boulder on the side of the road, an obstacle that, if used right, could be the perfect trap. He could use the truck's size and weight to his advantage. The sound of the bikers grew louder behind him as they approached the narrowing gap. The leader was still out there, his bike roaring with fury, but Jim didn't flinch. He kept his eyes locked on the boulder as the truck sped toward it. The bikers were closing in, their headlights now visible in the distance. At the last possible second, Jim swerved the truck, sending it into a controlled slide. The tires screeched in protest as the truck's massive frame cut across the dirt road, forcing the gang to swerve in an attempt to avoid the looming boulder. But they were too late. The first biker collided with the boulder, his bike flipping violently as it collided with the massive rock. The second biker wasn't far behind, but his reaction time was too slow. He skidded off the road and into the ravine, the sound of his bike crashing into the rocks echoing through the valley. The third biker tried to steer clear, but the chaos had already started. The remaining bikers struggled to regain control as they watched their comrades fall one by one. For a moment, the valley was eerily quiet. The truck rolled to a stop as Jim's breath came in short, desperate bursts. His pulse pounded in his ears as he checked the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the leader charging at him from the dust. But the leader didn't come. Instead, the remaining bikers slowed down, hesitant, realizing they had been outwitted. Jim could see the leader in the distance, struggling to gather his fallen gang. His face was twisted with fury, but Jim wasn't going to wait around for him to make a move. In a flash, Jim gunned the engine and sped forward, the truck lurching back into motion. The road ahead was still treacherous, but the bikers were too scattered to catch him now. Jim didn't look back. He kept his focus on the path ahead, pushing the truck to its limits. Knowing this was his moment to escape. The valley began to open up, and the road straightened. Jim's heart was still racing, but there was a flicker of hope now. He was getting away. He had done it. But just as his truck cleared the final bend, Jim saw something that made him stop dead in his tracks. Patrol car. He couldn't believe his eyes. The flashing lights of the police cruiser reflected off the trees, and the sound of its sirens cut through the air like a beacon of salvation. The bikers were nowhere in sight. The patrol car's lights blinked as it came to a stop in front of Jim. The officer behind the wheel looked at Jim with a raised eyebrow, but there was no question in his voice as he spoke. "You need a hand?" Jim exhaled deeply, his whole body sagging with relief. He wasn't in the clear just yet, but the police were here. The bikers had been stopped. And Jim, he was alive. "Yeah," Jim said, his voice hoarse but steady. "Yeah, I could use some help." As the officer stepped out of the cruiser and approached, Jim leaned back in his seat, his body finally relaxing after hours of terror. The nightmare was over. The fight was over. He had survived.